Hi everyone, did Sparta exist in the Bronze Age? You know, one of the reasons why this is such an interesting question is because Sparta figures prominently in the Iliad, and traditionally the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War, is considered to have occurred in the Bronze Age, or the Mycenaean era. So since Homer clearly describes Sparta as playing a prominent role, after all, Helen was from Sparta. So since Sparta has a prominent role in the story, it stands to reason that it's an interesting question. Well, did Sparta really exist in the Bronze Age, as Homer apparently presents? Well, this is a question which has a simple answer and a more complicated answer. So let's start with the simple answer. No, it didn't. Sparta did not exist in the Bronze Age. Archaeology makes that very clear. The site of Sparta, or Lacedaemon as it's also called, first emerged in the 10th century BCE. It seems that just after the year 1000 BCE, 4 distinct villages emerged, and then just a few decades later, in about 950, they were merged into a single settlement. So that's when Sparta actually originated. So it dates to the 10th century BCE, which is decidedly after the Bronze Age. There is no evidence of any notable settlement prior to the 10th century, prior to the year 1000 BCE. So that's the simple answer to the question, and if you're satisfied with that, then you can go and watch some other videos if you like. However, it does get more interesting than that. So there are lots of people who say, okay, Sparta itself didn't actually exist in the Bronze Age. However, there was a nearby settlement, which was the Mycenaean Sparta, the Bronze Age Sparta. So you may have heard of the Menelaion. So that is a location which is about 5 kilometers away from Sparta, and that is apparently where Menelaus and Helen were worshipped in ancient times. So at this nearby site, the Menelaion, it's clear that this was inhabited in the Bronze Age. The evidence for a settlement here dates back to at least as early as the 15th century BCE, so long before when the Trojan War was believed to have taken place, and habitation here continued right through until the end of the Bronze Age. So this would include a settlement that existed at the time, the traditional date rather, of the Trojan War. So many people try to argue that this was the Bronze Age or Mycenaean Sparta, and that this was the settlement that Homer was referring to when he referred to Sparta, or rather Lacedaemon. He was referring to this Bronze Age site, about 5 kilometers from the actual Sparta of antiquity. However, despite how popular this argument is, there are some serious problems with it. So to understand what the issue is, we need to understand what people in antiquity said about this site. So we see this site described by several ancient writers, for example Herodotus, Pausanias, and also Isocrates. So various people mentioned this site, and what did they say about it? Well, consider for example what Isocrates said. He wrote, "For even to the present day at Therapne in Laconia, the people offer holy and traditional sacrifices to them both," that is, to Helen and Menelaus. The reason that this is so important is because he specifically says Therapne in Laconia. Laconia was the name of that whole region of Greece, where Sparta and various other settlements were. So he calls it Therapne in Laconia. He doesn't call it Therapne in Sparta or Therapne in Lacedaemon. He calls it Therapne in Laconia. So it is its own place. It's not a place in Sparta. It's not considered part of Sparta. It's not considered an extension or something belonging to Sparta. It is its own place. It is Therapne in Laconia. We see this same term used by Herodotus and Pausanias. They call it Therapne. They don't call it Sparta. They don't indicate that it's part of Sparta or Lacedaemon. So the Greeks had a name for this site, where the Menelaion is. The Greeks had a name for that. It was a distinct place. It had its own distinct name. It was not considered part of Sparta. It was never called Sparta. So if Homer was referring to Therapne, where the Menelaion is, if he was referring to Therapne, he would have called it Therapne. He wouldn't have called it Sparta or Lacedaemon. So instead of referring to this Bronze Age settlement here at the Menelaion as the Bronze Age Sparta, we should call it the Bronze Age Therapne, because that's what it was. For comparison, let's take the towns of Bognor and Chichester in southern England. So Bognor and Chichester are separated by about 5 kilometers, just like Sparta and Therapne. Now at Chichester, there's a Roman settlement that was Noviomagus. So would we call that Roman settlement Roman Bognor? Well, obviously not. No one would do that because it's not Roman Bogna. It was Roman Chichester. We wouldn't call it Roman Bogna just because it's near Bogna, because it's 5 kilometers away. It's its own place. That place today has its own name. It's Chichester. So when we refer to that Roman settlement, we talk about it as being Roman Chichester. We wouldn't ever call it Roman Bogna because they are two separate places with their own distinct names. It's the same with Therapne and Sparta. This Bronze Age site in Homer's time and afterwards had its own name. It was Therapne. It makes no sense to refer to it as Sparta or Lacedaemon as if that was considered to be the same as Sparta. It wasn't. And we know that people were still familiar with that place. It was still considered to be its own distinct location. It wasn't just somewhere in the countryside next to Sparta. It was a place that was still inhabited. People still went there. They still made offerings there. We know that from archaeology. There's pottery there from the late geometric period, or maybe as late as the early archaic era. But in any case, people were going there and making offerings before Homer wrote his Iliad. So everything indicates that it was a distinct place with its own name, even as early as when Homer was writing. If he had been referring to that place, he would have called it Therapne, not Lacedaemon. Now you might think, okay, well let's say he just called it Lacedaemon or Sparta because that's the name of the closest major city in his time to that area. But that doesn't work either because he uses plenty of obscure place names. Many of them are so obscure that we don't even know where they were. So there's no reason why he couldn't have used the name Therapne if that's what he was referring to. He wouldn't have been afraid to use a random obscure place name. So there's really no valid basis for the idea that Homer was referring to this site, the Bronze Age settlement at Menelaion, at Therapne, when he was referring to Sparta. There's no good basis for that conclusion at all. But that does, of course, leave unanswered the question, well, why does he refer to Sparta then, if the Trojan War happened in the Mycenaean era? Well, regarding why Sparta appears, notice this quote from Hans van Wees, a prominent Homeric scholar. Elsewhere, all recent studies agree Homeric geography largely mirrors the landscapes and settlements of the late 8th or 7th century, despite earlier attempts to show that it corresponds to the geography of Mycenaean Greece. So in other words, it's no surprise that Sparta appears, because the description of the world as a whole, the geopolitical world that Homer presents in the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's a match for basically Homer's own time, not Mycenaean times. So it's no surprise at all that Sparta appears, even as a prominent location, because it was prominent in Homer's time. It's really got nothing to do with the Mycenaean era at all. Now you might be left thinking, does this mean that the Trojan War didn't happen in the Mycenaean era, but actually happened much closer to Homer's time? What a fascinating question for another video. For now though, if you'd like to learn about the second forgotten St. Patrick of Dark Age Britain, then come back next time for my next video.